Today, we are organizing the first of the open lectures. Today, we have in our midst Professor Bibhash Choudhury, an esteemed friend and colleague of mine. He is from Gauhati University, and I don't think he needs much of an introduction. Bibhash has today agreed to talk on a very interesting topic, approaching the post-colonial situation and condition. And he is going to concentrate on literature, theory, as well as practice. So I don't think I must tell you much about the topic. I leave that task to the capable mind and mouth of my elder brother, Bibhash Choudhury. Sufficing to say that approaching the post-colonial condition has got many dimensions: ontological, epistemological, as well as aesthetic. I hope in today's lecture, Bibhash is going to chart new territories and mesmerize us with his deliberations. So without much further ado, let me now request Professor Bibhash Choudhury to address us.
Thank you so much, Amit, and good morning. Good morning to everyone. It is indeed a great privilege and honor for me to be a part of this lecture series organized by the University of Gour, Banga. Today I am going to look at as Amit has pointed out, the post-colonial condition and how we can approach it and how we can make sense of it in the present context. Now, I would like to begin my presentation with a poem that was published about a month back. This poem was written by an Australian writer called Ellen van Nierven. Now, Ellen van Nierven is particularly in the news for two different reasons. The poem I am going to talk about is a poem which is part of her anthology of poems which came out last month called Throat. Now, before this anthology, she had also published short stories and other poems, and there were certain issues involved in her writing, primarily because of the subjects that she dealt with, but also because of the fact that she is an Australian Aboriginal writer. Ellen van Nierven is a very young writer. She is 30 now, and this book, Throat, it highlights a lot of issues which I found to be very, very relevant in the context of what we are looking at today. Now, the poem that I'm going to refer to, and I'm going to come to her writing subsequently, the poem is called Call a Spade a Spade. Now, it is, of course, a very, very commonly used phrase. Now, what she does here in this poem, let me present the poem before you. We'll go forward accordingly. Call a spade a spade. A heart, a diamond, a club, a club. Call it invasion, not settlement. Call it genocide, not colonization. Call it theft, not establishment. Now, what she is asking here, the poem continues, I'll come to the poem. what she's asking here is to face things as they are and not really deal with the language which was inherited following colonization. So she is calling for a revision of the terms through which we approach our current context. Now, in this particular circumstance, look at the way she is juxtaposing the different words. For instance, she is saying, call it theft, not establishment. So a particular apparatus was sought to be established by the colonial regime or different regimes in different parts of the world. And she says, call it theft. And then she says, call it genocide. And she asks her Australian fellow citizens to look at their own heritage. And she then goes on to say that you should not call January 26 Australia Day. Why is she talking about it like that? Because she says that the whole history writing process in Australia, or of making Australia what it is something that needs to be looked at again. So she says, don't shy away from telling the truth. Don't shy away from telling the truth. And she's also asking for the individual to take responsibility. So she says, don't say no worries, say I worry. So not only is she asking for people to take a stand, she's also saying that we need to look at these terms, the terms which we have been living with. So the whole idea of colonization as a process of history, as a political condition, is something that she is asking for people to look at again. And then she is saying that this is not something that deals with the past. She's saying for the future of our country, our environment, for the future of our country, our environment. If we fail to listen and to act, so the human failure to respond to react to address is going to bring about serious consequences. So she says, and further on in the poem she says, that don't say we are full, say we are open. It's about, say, suppose we are going to an eatery and we find it and there's a board saying we are full. So she's saying be accommodative, be understanding, open up. And then when it comes towards the end of the poem, she says, call yourself an ally, call yourself a mate. So she's asking, how are we to look at the present circumstance? She's asking for a revision of the whole history writing process. She's asking for individual responsibility. She's asking for something that feeds the whole idea of the other. And the whole process of othering becomes important here because in this particular context, her origins are also very interesting. She is an Australian Aboriginal writer. She comes from the south of Queensland, and she is both, her lineage is, because of, as you can find out from her name, Ellen van Nierven. So she is of joint stock. She is partly Dutch and she is partly Australian Aboriginal. So she is someone who is looking at the question of identity in a very complex circumstance in contemporary Australian society. In fact, one of her poems from her earlier book and was called Mangoes. And when I first read that book by Ellen van Nierven, which was in 2016, what struck me was her choice of vocabulary, her use of words which we are familiar with. But the context in which he uses them. So what happened was that this poem called Mangoes, which is from an earlier anthology, that was part of the syllabus, that became part of the syllabus in school. And then when it came in a question paper, that was the source of a controversy. The Australian children, especially in the cities, in Sydney and Melbourne, they start writing in Twitter that this is a poem we don't like, this is a poem we don't understand, this does not relate to us. So what Ellen van Leeuwen is touching, or what she's referring to, what she's drawing towards, is something that shatters the veneer, the surface of equilibrium. It asks questions, very, very difficult questions of identity, of sociability, of understanding, and of otherness. Now, keeping this thing in mind, if you look at a very, very fascinating book, a book called Dark Emu. Dark Emu is a book by Bruce Pascoe. Now, Bruce Pascoe is, again, a remarkable writer, remarkable Australian writer. And this book, Dark Emu, deals with the whole idea of colonial historiography in the colonial times, and how the whole idea of Australia was being mapped in history. Was being mapped in history as the pre-colonial and the colonial. So before the colonizers arrived, there was a different kind of Australia. The Aboriginals were primarily hunters and gatherers. That narrative has been the consistent narrative of Australia. That it is only after the coming of the colonizers into Australia that the Australian landscape changed. And in a very, very remarkable book of post-colonial theory by Paul Carter, it's called The Road to Botany Bay, which is published in the late 80s. In that book, he had talked about the significance of place names, how Cook came to Australia, and how subsequent migrations into the Australian landscape started altering the place names, because the place names had earlier Australian Aboriginal names, and now these names were anglicized. They became different names, and with the name, the place changed its character. So what Bruce Pascoe does in this book, which was published in 2014, a new edition came out in 2018, a revised edition came out in 2019, last year, and immediately in 2019 when it came out, it became a massive global bestseller, Dark Emu, because it talks about, it retraces the steps of history, takes us to Australia before the coming of the colonizers. And Bruce Pascoe himself is an Aboriginal. So he is able to reconnect to that heritage. And he demonstrates by study of archive, by study of oral narratives, by folk culture, and doing real archaeological and agricultural research. He points out that this is the time, much before the colonizers arrived, this is the time when the entire world of Australia was agricultural in nature. So Dark Emu deals with the whole idea of agriculture prior to the coming of the colonizers. In fact, this is one of the landmark books that can enable us to revisit the whole idea of colonial historiography in Australia. But this understanding of a pre-colonial world order, a pre-colonial world order that is so difficult to access in terms of documentation, in terms of reality, in terms of the narratives that are in circulation. What Bruce Pascoe does is to invite us to look at the other side, look at the world from a completely different perspective, a perspective with which we have not been very familiar. Now, what Bruce Pascoe does is also to ask questions of something that we know as white supremacy. Now, this whole question of white supremacy is not confined to Australia. It's something that has been part of the entire apparatus, entire colonial arrangement from the time of the colonial establishment all over the world. Now this is something that has again emerged in narrative theory, in our cultural discourse. And I would like to refer you to a particular book by Laila F. Saad. Now, Laila F. Saad is currently based in the UK. She was, her parents were, of course, of African origin. Her father was from Zanzibar, and her mother was from Kenya. And what happened there was that when she started her childhood, her progress, and when she started looking at the world of UK, where she grew up, she realized that there were a lot of problems. But the problems were related to her identity. Problems were related to how she was looked upon. So she was narrating this entire experience, this whole personalized experience in this book called Me and White Supremacy. So this is something that becomes very interesting in post-colonial writing today. I'm going to come to that, the question of post-colonial autobiography. So what happens here is that she is now asking questions of her identity as well as the manner in which she is approached as an individual in society, the society which she calls her own, the society into which she is born, and the society that she occupies. So such a circumstance actually enables us to look at not only Laila's situation, because Laila now doesn't live in the UK. She lives in Qatar. She lives in Doha with her husband and her 2 children. She is talking of life in the UK, and she is also talking of the perspective from which she can see, or she is now seeing UK from a distance, and the whole idea of her identity and her situation now appears to be in stark contrast to her circumstance, because she says that she has 3 barriers to cross. She is not white, and she is a woman, and she is a Muslim. So she has these 3 barriers to cross, and the first thing that she has to encounter and she has to deal with is white supremacy. Now, this term white supremacy has a very, very interesting dimension, especially in terms of a paper which was published in 1889. There are 2 versions of the paper. It is called White Privilege. White Privilege was published in 1989 as a working paper by Peggy McIntosh. Now, Peggy McIntosh's paper is very, very interesting because she says the paper is interesting because she talks about the privilege of the invisible knapsack. It's like a bag that you carry on your back, okay? And you have all the tools. Because you're white, so you're privileged. You walk into an office, you walk into a bar, you take a walk in the street. Because you're white, you have that invisible privilege. It shapes your identity. It shapes how you look at others. It shapes how others look at you. So this is something that Peggy McIntosh, herself being white, she was born with. And she was realizing, oh, this is something that I have inherited. Not because I belong to a class, not because I belong to a gender, not because I belong to this society, but because I'm white. Irrespective of where I go, I have this privilege. It's this invisible privilege, this invisible bag of goodies that I'm white. Whether I'm in Africa or India or UK or US, I'm white. So this white privilege, this whole idea of white privilege, and how that actually is determining interpersonal relationships, social interaction, and of course the circumstances which you occupy. So lot of other differences are flattened. The rich poor, the gender divide, the question of social class and caste. But the moment you're white, the moment you're seen as white, perceived as white, the whole equation changes. So one of the important issues that has lingered from the time of colonialism, we find this in Othello. Othello is ostracized. Othello is seen as an outcast because of the same invisible white privilege that the society, the whole European society, actually looks at him differently because he's not white. So this has persisted from the time of Shakespeare, from the time the whole world started looking at, the European world started looking at other worlds differently, from that time to today, when Laila Assad writes about white supremacy. It's the same thread that continues. And it is becoming more and more nuanced, it's becoming subtler, it is becoming more and more provocative in its silent determination to persist in society. Now, of course, when you look at such situations, we find that certain connotations which have been in circulation in postcolonial discourse and postcolonial theory are now being looked at differently. We can look at those same terms slightly in a very, very different circumstance, or the contours of those terms have been altered because of the changing nature of society. They persist, but operate in different ways. So if you look at a novel, to give an example of how this works and how complex the whole situation has become, a new novel which is published on the 2nd of June, that is this month itself, which has immediately become a bestseller for a variety of reasons. But I found this novel to be interesting for what we are looking at today. This novel is by Megha Mazumdar. Megha Mazumdar is, again, a very, very young writer who was born in Kolkata, lived in Kolkata, and then went on to study anthropology at Harvard. And then she wrote this novel. This novel is called A Burning. A Burning. It is a novel which deals with a particular location in Bengal, and what is referred to as a burning is the burning of a train by terrorists. And this young girl, her name is Jivan. The three main characters in this novel, one is Jivan, who is a very young girl. She's Muslim, she's young, and she lives by the side of the location where it took place. So what she does is to make a video and puts it up in social media. And immediately she's arrested. She's put in jail. Then we have another girl called Lovely, who is a third gender, who is a Hijra, and she has great aspirations to become a Bollywood actress. And the third character, the most important character, who actually looks at this complex situation through a different kind of a narrative, and that narrative is highly political. He is a man called P.T. Sir, the physical instructor who actually taught Jivan. Now, all these three characters, all these three individuals look at the same situation through three different lenses. Now, they are non-whites. So if we look at the Australian Aboriginal context, we see that when we look at something like India, and when we look at it from the outside, it appears to be a very, very monolithic entity, but it's not. Each individual looks at the situation differently. Same situation, different experiences, different aspirations. So what we get here is something very, very interesting. What the title suggests is the physical burning, is the physical demolition. But what it focuses on is something very, very interesting in terms of the psychic reality, the psychological mindset that comes to occupy and dominate and determine the manner in which people live, the manner in which people conduct themselves. And these aspirations continue. These aspirations may change the tracks, but they continue. So it's very difficult to let go of the inheritance, the cultural and psychological inheritance. So the pressures that we find, the pressures that are there upon these people, each of these people, in the manner in which they operate, these pressures are very, very intense. So on the one hand, as individuals, they have had to negotiate. They have had to negotiate with their immediate physical situation. That, okay, this is where I find myself in jail. This is what I have to negotiate. Then there are political alliances, there are political pressures. But what Megha Mozumdar is looking at, not simply the political and social circumstance. She's looking at the difficulty of accessing the individual in such a complex social setup. How difficult it is to access the individual, and how difficult it is to make a commentary or a discursive proposition on the behalf of another individual. That this is my fellow Indian, this is my fellow citizen. It's very difficult. So the inaccessibility of coming to terms, the whole inaccessible apparatus that actually operates and controls an individual's mind, the working, that is something that runs through a burning. Now, what Megha Mozumdar is talking about is something that asks us to revise our perceptions of the whole idea of colonial mentality or colonial discourse. Now, we know that Albert Memmi was a Tunisian Jewish intellectual. He lived quite a long life. He was born in 1920, died very recently, almost 100 years. So Albert Memmi in 1957 had published this book, which was, of course, a landmark book at when it was published. It is one of the important foundational texts of postcolonialism. But now those things are being looked at critically. The book was The Colonizer and the Colonized. He you can say that calls a spade, the colonizer and the colonized. But how are we to look at that circumstance that Albert Memmi is talking about? He says that the colonizer is always in a position of dominance. The colonized starts accepting the colonizer as someone who is his or her master. The whole master-slave Hegelian dialectic is in operation, and there is a discursive structure at work through which the whole process of colonial discourse is internalized. There's an internalization that takes place, that is start looking at things as if that is natural. This was the proposition put forward by Memmi. Is it like that? Because Africa as a continent is very complex. Africa is a very, very complex continent. Why is it complex? Because the whole idea that we have is, okay, this is the heart of darkness, that this is where we're going to, and this is how things are. The whole perceptive myth that Marlowe took when he went to Congo in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, that is something that needs to be looked at again, not only from the African point of view, but also from the point of view of the discourse and what it entails. Now, staying on in Africa, I would like to draw your attention to a very interesting travel writer. She is Meera Dattani. Meera Dattani. She is a travel writer, and she has a very, very interesting history. Meera Dattani was her heritage. When you look at her heritage, her parentage, she was living with her parents in Uganda. But Uganda, we know, is our primary association with Uganda, or understanding of Uganda is, of course, we cannot forget or erase the figure of Idi Amin. Now, Idi Amin was the Ugandan dictator. And suddenly, in 1972, Idi Amin declared that all the Asians living in Uganda must leave. So this created a lot of problems. Now, of course, you can't just leave your house and go away. Overnight, you can't say, okay, now I'm going to leave. You can't, this is not possible. But that was decreed, that was the order. And within a very short span of time, so Mira Datani writes about her mother. Her mother was Shobha Popat. And so her mother had to leave her parental house, her family house. And so what kind of a colonial world is this? What kind of an experience is this? So Mira Datani writes about the complex nature of looking at the African other. So she writes about her mother. She says that when she was looking at the childhood, her own childhood, she heard tales of Kampala. She was hearing tales of her family, her mother growing up, her mother's father, her grandfather growing up. And so the reality of Kampala, the reality of Uganda was very vivid in her mind. And it was not until 1990 that Shobha Popat went back to Uganda. And so the whole idea that, okay, this Africa is a country of the blacks, Africa was colonized by the whites. Things are not like that. Things are pretty complex. And it was in 2008 when Mira Datani herself with her mother went to her homeland, mother's homeland. Her mother still thinks and believes and feels that this is my homeland. Uganda is where I live. This is my country. But the whole political and cultural establishment in the 80s and 90s was very, very antagonistic to Asians living in Uganda. Similar kind of situations we find in Kenya. That's what Gour writes about in one of his novels. So you find that today, when you look at the post-colonial circumstance or post-colonial condition, even in the erstwhile colonial locations, it's not simply the white and the black. There are interesting dimensions. Now, in the location of culture, Homi Bhabha had talked about the condition of the hybrid, the ambivalent situation, the colonizer, the colonized, and the hybridity of the individual who was neither trained in the cultural worldview or was not completely at home in the English or French or Dutch that he grew up with, or she grew up with. But what we see today is not so simple. It's not simply colonizer, the colonized, and the hybrid individual. So the individual inheritance, the cultural inheritance has come to occupy a very important place. And that is what we find in the example of Mira Datani. The Mira Datani's mother, Shobha Popat, is now looking at two different kinds of worlds. The world in which she lives in the UK, and the world to which she belonged, the world which is her own, the world in which she had lived her entire life before marriage. And that world, even if she goes back, she cannot belong. And even if she has left, she cannot leave it behind. So things are always in a state of flux, in a different kind of flux. So the flux of the 1990s, when Homi Bhabha was writing or was talking about hybridity in 1994 in Location of Culture, that was different from, or that is different from the kind of flux we are talking about today. Now, when we're talking of flux and when we're talking of movement, one of the important aspects of this can be seen in the whole idea of migration. The migration is, of course, as you know, a very, very interesting trope. Very, very interesting trope in post-colonial literature, or in the whole idea of looking at colonial experience. So when we look at the colonial world order, and when we look at migration, I would like to take you to the year 1950. Now, in the year 1950, two young Trinidadians from the Caribbean islands came to London. One was Sam Selvon, and the other was George Lemming. Now, George Lemming, in a very, very interesting account of his departure, of his movement, talks about how this thing was working. That means George Lemming said that when I and Sam came, we thought that we are going to a different world. It is not the world of class difference, not the world of conflict, not the world of individual antagonism. It's a different world. So they had a very, very different view of England. When they came to England, they found that it was the same. So on the one hand, apart from them being different in terms of where they had come from, they found that the same antagonisms were in operation in this new society. So they were not coming to a very rosy kind of a land, of a land of equilibrium. No, they were coming to a place of conflict. Same thing continued. And when Sam Selvon in Lonely Londoners, his most famous book, and this is the book by which he is most often referred to and known by, he talks of this world, and he was trying to therefore look at this world that was talking of the whole migrant experience, but then he was also trying to look at it through a different kind of a language, a different kind of a linguistic register. He realized that the English that he had, the English that he had known, and the English that he had come to were very different. It had to do with the whole idea of what he called a nation language. But the point is not so simple. What we are looking at is not simply what he was addressing at the time. There are two very, very interesting reasons for this. One was that the conventional response to Selvon and Lemming has been to see them as outsiders in the English literary landscape. That here are two West Indian writers who have brought with them their own cultural inheritance. They write in a different kind of a language. They write in what is known to be a nation language, a language that is determined by a different kind of a cultural register. Now, Simon Gikandi has actually examined the archival situation, and he has shown that what Sam Selvon and George Lemming was doing, what both of them were doing, was something that had to do with their own sense of two things. One, their sense of roots, and their sense of location. But as Eleke Bohemar in subtitling in her book on colonial and post-colonial literature, that is something that I find relevant here. She calls it migrant metaphors. So the whole idea of migrancy doesn't quite leave. This is what Simon Gikandi talks about. That he says that in Caribbean, the whole idea of modernity in Caribbean literature, the trope of migrancy is continuously, insistently present. So although they write of a different location, write of a different kind of experience, the whole sense of being on the move as individuals in a particular society a society which has accepted them but not quite. That is something that keeps on running as a trend. And this does not allow it does not allow them to quite settle down. This does not quite allow them to settle down as writers, comfortable either with the language or with the subjects. So there is a kind of angst that is woven into the fabric, into the texture of the writing. It's not simply personal, it's not simply cultural, but it has to do with the circumstance in which they are seen historically, or they're made to see themselves historically. So one of the important tropes of postcolonial writing we can see here comes to figure in the form of home. What is home, and how do we approach the whole idea of home? They're not homeless, they live in their homes, but how homed are they in? Now, in the context of the United Kingdom, the whole idea of home is interesting because it is not simply the African-American writer who comes from the Caribbean or comes from Africa, who comes and settles down in the UK who faces this problem. The idea of home, being outsider in the location in which you live, this is something that occupies the Irish. And I would just like to briefly mention a book called Home. It's a novel called Home, and it's by Frank Ronan, the Irish writer Frank Ronan. It has to do with his experience, the protagonist's experience of living in a situation where he feels he is an outsider. But because he's seen as an outsider, but because he feels as an outsider, because he cannot quite come to terms with the world that surrounds him. And he doesn't have any of these issues of racial difference, of class difference, but he still feels that he's an outsider. This sense of being outside the world that you have to step into, this transformed dimension of the social environment. This is something that Ellen van Nierven, as we looked at, was talking about. And this is something that we find the West Indian writers talking about. That, okay, we are at home, but only partially. It takes us back to the classic term that Homi Bhabha used, a kind of in-betweenness. Now, this in-betweenness also has to be seen a little elastically. Because it is not that they feel they don't belong. The point is they feel they don't belong enough. So this creates this new dimension of where are they situated, now what is it that they're looking ahead to. Someone like Ellen van Nierven can say, okay, I am Australian, but I don't accept the Australian Foundation Day, because Australia has been continuously Australia even before the colonizers came. Is it the point that can be made by Lamming and Selvan? Not quite. And if you look at someone like Selvan, Selvan's father was a third generation Tamil Christian who came from then Madras, now Chennai, who came from there and who went and settled in the West Indies. And then he migrated from there to the UK. So you can see this whole idea, this trope of travel, something that we find in two very interesting contexts. One is, of course, the classic Edward Said essay, Traveling Theory. He says that the way when a discourse travels, it changes character. It becomes localized. It acquires its own characteristics. It is like a ball that is gathering its own steam, and accretions and other things are falling off. So this propensity of the idea to change its contours as it travels, this propensity is something that we find in the current writing and the way things are looked at now. Take the classic example of Amitav Ghosh. Now, Amitav Ghosh is, I refer to one particular book, In an Antique Land. Now, here is an Asian going to Africa, going to Egypt, in an antique land. The whole idea of antiquity. Antiquity, we know, classically is associated with the Greeks. So when Amitav Ghosh goes to Africa, to Egypt, and here's an anthropologist looking at things from a particular lens, and he sees a different kind of society. So in an antique land is an examination of many parameters of experience. It's an examination of who he is, what he's looking at, how his perceptions change, how the more and more he comes to realize and understand and know the local environment, the more he discovers his ability to respond, and how silence plays a part. This whole idea of silence, and restraint. I think one of the things that we find fascinating about in an antique land is the measure of restraint, the restraint that is required, not because you understand the other, but because you understand that your understanding will never reach the other. And this restraint is something that can facilitate your knowledge about self and the worlds that you don't know. This is one of the lessons that you find in Amitav Ghosh's In an Antique Land. And this comes a long way from Things Fall Apart. Because the moment Okonkwo surrenders to the orthodoxies of his own culture, and is unable to adapt to the changing world order, the world order that is going to stay for him, his culture, his society, he has no way out. But in a post-colonial circumstance, people have learned, adapted, and understood the value of giving space when understanding doesn't work. Now, I would like to refer to a particular story. This is a very interesting story by a very young Manipuri writer called Jim Kasam. Now, Jim Kasam was born in Ukhrul. He now stays in New Delhi. Jim Kasam is a Naga, but he stays in Manipur. You know that in Manipur there is a substantial Naga population. And in his short story collection called Homecoming and Other Stories, there's one story which is set in the time of the Kohima War. This was when the Japanese were trying to enter India, and they had this very famous Battle of Kohima. But the British thwarted them, and the story is set in that context. So the story is like this: that there's a young teacher called Somi. Somi is a young man. He's a teacher. He has a family. His wife goes to work. He teaches his children and other children of the village. So he's the only matriculate from the village. This is set in the 1940s. So what happens here is that Somi has a very lazy life. And one day a woman comes to him, and he just sits around and looks at people going to work. He's the only one there. He's the one who teaches. So he has a lot of time. When he doesn't have to teach, he stays there and watches. It's like being a grand observer, a spectatorial individual. So he looks at people and wonders what they're doing. One day he finds that there are a new group of people who have arrived, the Japanese. And with the Japanese, there's a man called Naota, who is quite an old man, who is a hardened soldier. And they say they're very hungry. He says that Naota says that we have not been in touch with society. We have not had food. Things are difficult here. So Somi feeds them, takes care of them. The villagers take care of them. And of course, there is the whole scene of the warplanes coming and the British coming in, and eventually we find that Nauta dies by a bullet wound, and Somi is trying to take Nauta and the other soldiers to the hill where a Japanese plane has crashed to take out whatever they can, but then Nauta is killed, and Nauta is then on the back of Somi. And Somi, the ending is something that is interesting here, because Somi realizes that this is a different kind of life that he now faces. And the story tantalizingly ends there. And we wonder whether Somi will also be killed by the British army, which is closing in. The story is titled Killing the Silence. Killing the silence. Can we really deal with silence? How long can we take in this silence? And what is the nature of silence? And if you look at colonial writing, if you look at colonial literature, this has been a very, very important trope. Silence, heart of darkness, things fall apart. And in fact, in a novel like Burning, you find silence plays a part, that sometimes silence is effective as a political strategy, as a political tool, as something with which you can hit. We find this in the stories of Mahashita Devi. But sometimes silence is a giveaway. Silence is a weakness. And can you really kill that silence? Can you really come to terms with the silence? Jim Kassom, therefore, looks at the complex nature of responsibility for an individual. He's a Naga, he lives in Manipur, and the soldiers come to Imphal, they're fighting the Kohima War. So it's not only about geography, it's not only about identity, it's not only about being a Tangkhul Naga, it's also about the complex hierarchies that operate. The colonizer and the colonized is not the only hierarchy. You cannot just stay with Mimi and say, okay, this is how the hierarchy is. If here is someone who dominates and here is someone who is dominated. The domination takes place, as Laila Saad talks about, at different levels. After all, being a woman, and in that story we find that Somi's wife is working all the time. And this grand old woman comes and says that, oh, you have become a lazy man. So the layers through which we are looking at the situation have become now very, very apparent. And the whole idea of racial discrimination, in a very interesting book called The Great Migration, which has just come out by Sonia Shah. Sonia Shah talks about the nature of migration and how people have migrated, not simply physically. It's about physical migration, it's about moving from one place to another, but also about migration culturally. The intellectual migration, the migration that takes place in the mind, the manner in which we migrate from one position to another, from the childhood to adolescence to youth to middle age, this migration that takes place. And this looking back at different selves, something that Conrad was looking at, this older Marlowe looking at the younger Marlowe. There's a migratory tendency, the migration of the selves many sides and occupying multiple positions. So when we look at such a circumstance, what we find is that today we are looking at a very, very adaptive environment, which has led to a completely changed worldview, a combative worldview. We find the individual more combative, community is combative, showing greater resilience, but also accompanied by a greater and insistently greater intolerance. So what we found to be important in Amitav Ghosh's Indian Antique Land or Selvan and Lemming, the knowledge that I don't understand and therefore display restraint is now changing, because now things are getting more and more volatile. And when you look at circumstances like this, you find that this volatility is taken to be a sign of resilience, of tenacity, but it is not. It is that the edges of society are getting more and more frayed and more complex because of the pressures on the individual to conform, to stand up, and to make it count. And when you look at these transformed spaces, social spaces, the individual's own understanding is seriously threatened and challenged. So when you find someone like Somi or someone like Amitav Ghosh, the narrator, or even someone like Marlowe, 100 years apart, you'll find that it is the negotiation of this self. How do I come to terms with this self? The self is the site of inquiry. And today, when you look at the writing that we have today, novels, plays, poems, Manjula Padmanabhan's play, Consequences, which has just come out. Now, if you look at that play, she's saying that this is something that has been a source of fear for many people. Consequences. So it's a very intertextualized play where a playwright and character but the whole subject, as she writes in her introduction, is about the facing of the consequences. How do you look at consequences? If you go back to the early literature of the colonial period, you'll find that this was not something that the individual is looking at, consequences. But today, consequences and the whole perception of consequences, the attendant signature of consequence, has come to occupy the post-colonial space. So it is not that we are less colonized, but I would say that we are becoming more and more traumatized by the pressures of the individual having to make it count. This is something that has always been. Othello has had this experience. He had to face that society. He had to make it count. Is it different today? It was the same with Antigone and Sophocles. But you have to make it count. But now the pressures are very, very insistent. And the individual is gradually feeling that the individual is more and more alone. It is that increasing solitariness of the individual that has come to occupy what has been called post-colonial life writing. So post-colonial life writing is different from, let's take an example, let's say the autobiographies of Jawaharlal Nehru or Mahatma Gandhi. The post-colonial life writing today, therefore, is more of a answering to the self, a testimonial of the times. And that answerability is not simply to the community, to the society. That is very much part of the whole situation. It is also a part of the individual's makeup. This is how I see myself being, and this is the whole process of becoming. This is what I have become. This is how I see. So there is a registry inbuilt, an individual's registry that's been built in today's literature. This is my sense of accountability, and it is something that is continuously ongoing. It's how things are looked at. Now, I was talking about post-colonial life writing and the whole circumstance and how things were getting different from the early 21st century. And the whole idea of the testimonial, the post-colonial writer, the writer today, the writer writing today is now looking at a different kind of reality in terms of how the writer has situated himself and come to understand the limitations of understanding. And it is this sense that there is a knowledge gap in the understanding of the world and also the understanding of the self that has come to occupy the contemporary literary scene. So it has become insistently a situation, more and more a situation of the self trying to justify and trying to understand the world of that order from which he has come, to which he has belonged, and to which he feels or she feels that he or she needs to make it count. So the question of accountability and answerability has come and fallen on this self, and the self has become more and more the site and register of a world that it is continually starting and continually engaging with and beginning to make sense. So this whole process is something that has found a new kind of layering, starting from, to give an example, or to go back to the example of Ellen van Nierven or Mira Datani. From that point to this point, we see that there's this engagement where the self unabashedly presents to the world a side, a different kind of side, which doesn't quite make sense or may not make sense other than it being the personalized space. But so here the personal is not simply political, the personal remains personal and is valid only because it is something that is testimonially relevant. It becomes relevant only because it is testimonially conditioned. So what we find here is that there is a greater understanding of the limitations of self and of the changing nature of the world and the violent circumstance, the violent pressures that take place. Because the violence is not simply physical, violence is also a kind of conditioning with which the person has to deal with in terms of the complex layering of society. So I think I'll end my presentation here, and I look forward to any questions or discussions that may take place. Thank you so much.
Amida, I'm Somi Pendro. I just saw Shorbanidhi is here. Shorbanidhi is from TDB College, Raniganj. She's the head of the Department of English Department. So is Shorbanidhi here still? So I would request her to begin.
Yes, I am here, very much here. And I would like to thank Professor Choudhury for an enthralling session. It is an honest confession that I have been taking copious notes as you spoke. And at the beginning of your talk, I was so happy that you began with the premise that I feel about post-colonialism. But your discussion of this gap between the understanding of the world and the self is simply wonderful. And this is the kind of direction that we seek from you.
Madam, excuse me. Madam, excuse me. Please come to the question, please.
Okay. So my question is to Professor Choudhury, is that in this gap between the understanding of the world and the self, how does literature play a part in bridging that gap?
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much. You see, what has emerged from what we are seeing in recent times is that literature is part of that very mix, actually. Literature is not something that is an ingredient to be brought into society from the outside. In fact, literature has found itself in the midst of what's going on, and it is both a vehicle and, of course, the form of address through which the whole experience is emerging in different kinds of discourses, whether it is autobiography, whether it is testimonial, whether it is poetry, whether it is kind of revisionist historiography that's taking place. So in a way, literature, by being so responsive, is trying to be the note taker of social change, which was not quite the situation, say, 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. So in that sense, the things have emerged differently today.
Thank you so much. And just an added question. Do you think that this lockdown and pandemic situation has somehow indirectly, insidiously brought us, the world and the self, a little together? Because we have all been introspective and, trying to look back when we have been idle?
In a way, I think lockdown has compelled us to take stock of where we stand as individuals.
Yes.
Yeah. So we have been compelled to face ourselves and de-routinize our own lives. So in that sense, yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is Professor Asimaranjan Padhi still there?
No, sir, he has left, I think.
Well, any other question, please come to the question straight, because we don't have much time at our disposal.
Hello.
Yes?
Hello. Yes. So good evening, Manavendra here. So thank you for this stimulating lecture. Sir, I have a question. It's not exactly a question, but when you are talking about this migration, and you referred to a book where that is talking about that the different phases of one's development as a process of migration, then can I just how do you look at changing someone like, say, Friday or the Prospero-Caliban relationship? Can you also take them as this ideas of conversion, converting someone's faith, as also a kind of process of migration? How do you look that in this context, in the context of the book that you referred?
Actually, Sonia Sa's book on migration is looking at physical migration, but the underpinning narrative is that the physical migration doesn't take place only physically. It also brings about a psychological change in the individual the moment movement starts. The more you move, the more psychologically impacted you are as you come in connection with, come in touch with different worlds, different societies, which are different from the place you left behind. So the psychological transformation takes place alongside the physical responses that happens in migration. Now with Caliban or someone like Friday, as characters or as individuals, we do not know enough of their individual worlds. We see them as narrated selves. We see them as they have been presented or objectified by the circumstance in which they're placed. So we do not quite have the internal worldview of someone like Caliban or Friday available to us. So in a way, they're inaccessible. Their individual circumstance psychologically remain inaccessible. Whereas if you look at today's writers, they open up their psychological worlds through narration, and they present that to the world as saying, okay, this is my world. So when Leila Saad writes, she writes me and white supremacy. So it may be different for someone else, but for me, this is the situation. So the self is presented as the register through which understanding can be done, not of the world, but of the self that writes. In the case of these characters, that access is not available. The whole traveling trope, the trope of migration, that is something will have to be modified in order to, or adapted if we are to look at these classic characters.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Amida, I mean, there are some questions in the chat box as well.
Please read them out one by one.
Yeah, I can see them. Let me respond. There's a question by Anupama Thakur. What is an individual being testimonially conditioned? Now, what happens here in post-colonial life writing or life writing that we have today is that the testimonial, in a sense that I am accountable for what I say. So that becomes my point of entry into the world, that okay, this is what I have to offer. So it becomes, it is like signing a testimonial. Okay, this is my signature, this is my experience, this is my narration. So it is that condition with which I enter the social discourse, the cultural discourse, and say, okay, this is my world, this is my narrative. So in a way, I authenticate the narrative by addressing the world and presenting to them, this is my testimonial. Okay, this is what I stand by. So this was not quite the situation when someone like, say, Bertrand Russell was writing his autobiography. The need for that explanation was not felt. That it was taken, okay, this is a life story and this is how I'm presenting. But now that has become a kind of a narrative, you can say ingredient, which is built into the structure of the autobiographies that we find today. There's another question here. It was by Aparna. I just wanted to ask a question, sir. Is Bruce Pascoe's dark emo response to the idea of worldling? Now this, yeah, thank you so much. The idea of worldling is associated with Edward Said. Bruce Pascoe is, of course, not writing as a post-colonial theorist. Bruce Pascoe is writing as someone who is in that world. Someone, he's, let's say, he's presenting an insider's view into the pre-colonial agricultural context of Australia. So I think this is a very, very interesting question in the sense that we can indeed look at the possibility of juxtaposing the worldling of making that world valid again for not only non-Aboriginal Australians, but for the whole idea of Australia to be revised. So yes, I think this is a very, very pertinent point that can be taken forward because he's not looking at colonial Australia, pre-colonial Australia as a break, but he's suggesting that in order to understand today's Australia, we need to understand pre-colonial Australia in terms of the continuity that it represents, and that thread being present in today's Australia, not as the colonial Australia being the new Australia and the pre-colonial being something very separate. So in that sense, the whole worldling, the whole experience of worldling is sought to be revised, not only for himself, but for everyone.
Sir, Riyanka Sharma has yeah, there's one more question, a rather longish question by Riyanka Sharma. Should I read it, sir?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, in connection to cultural colonization that has persisted beyond political emancipation, is it not true that language is one of the basic tools used by post-colonial writers to reclaim their identity? And certainly European languages were implemented to impose a Eurocentric notion, but the very same language is used in most of the narratives of resistance against colonization. So she wants your take on this.
Yeah, this is one of the classical positions in post-colonial theory, that this is what Gugi, what Hyongo had looked at, and he was contesting this whole idea of language and colonization in decolonizing the mind when he wrote this in 1983. What we are looking at today is that English being a colonizer's language, that is now, I think, not the issue for many writers. In fact, as Megha Mazumdar in an interview published 2 days back was talking about the very fact that she was very comfortable in English, and she found that this is one language in which she could represent Kolkata and the life of Bengal and the political circumstances of Bengal was best represented for her in English. So it being the colonizer's language, and the whole idea of the Empire Rights Pact, that is of course a very, very valid situation, and that is something through which stage postcolonialism has come through. But now I think the writer doesn't feel or deem it necessary to explain why English is the language that he or she uses. So in that sense, you can say that yes, but when you look at the colonial world from today's point of view, as we have seen, it's very complex. It's not simply black and white, or it's simply the native and the settler. So in that sense, things have evolved and become much more complex. What you have said is what the one who has put the question is has rightly pointed out. Yes, that is what has taken place, and that is what has happened. But it has also come a long way beyond that, and things are becoming much more complex. I would like to, if you want to look into this further, there is a discussion by Dipesh Chakrabarty and Amitav Ghosh in the Radical History volume of 2002, where it is a conversation on provincializing Europe, where both of them discuss this issue, the question of language, and how Europe was being provincialized by the people who were earlier colonized. So I think you can have a look at that.
Sir, one last question. I think we'll take this last question from Saurabh Patra, who wants to know whether in the COVID-19 perspective, the movement of the migrant laborers, I mean, is there any post-colonial, I mean, can that be read in terms of the post-colonial situation today?
Yeah, I in a way you can make use of the insights of post-colonial questioning or inquiry to address different issues. Migrant laborers in the present context, I think this has many dimensions: political, social, and of course economical. One of the things is that we can bring into from postcolonial discourse, or our understanding of postcolonialism, is that this calls for a responsiveness, not to see someone as the other, but someone for whom you are responsible. So in that sense, the insight of postcolonial inquiry can enable us to look at this issue more humanely, more critically, and of course in a way through which a lot of questions can be addressed, rather than seeing that I am not the migrant and that person is someone else, so I don't care. I think that needs to be seriously challenged and revised, and to see that, okay, this society is my responsibility, and he is as much I and as I am him. So in that sense, I think definitely this can be addressed. I think there's another question. It is about casteism has been there for a long time, and if it is a matter of domination, then India, Dalits are dominated by upper caste. Yeah, so I think this is where post-colonial understanding has contributed and can contribute in the sense that the whole response mechanism of post-colonial theory has been to look at issues that have been sidelined, that have been marginalized, and that it is, let's say, the media that provides space for people to present themselves in whatever way. The fact that the Dalits or the marginalized are or are required to be given, or they must be given, that is that space, the condition of space and the articulation of different views. I think that is something that post-colonial writing and post-colonial discourse definitely insists. So that can be one way of taking it forward.
Yes, I mean, no more questions, Amita.
So in that case, we must now sum it up. I begin the summing up business by thanking Professor Bibhash Choudhury for such a scintillating presentation. It's very thought-provoking. We have come full circle. We have covered almost the entire world, physically, locationally, obviously. At the same time, we have addressed certain issues about the self and the other, and the world as well. So when he was talking about literature, theory and practice, he has done justice to that structure of the title. And when I was beginning my introduction to the lecture, I talked about the 3 dimensions. And I'm really thankful to Bibhash for giving adequate space to the ontological, epistemological, and aesthetic dimension of the post-colonial condition, this process and this project. Actually, I must thank all my departmental colleagues for making this venture a success. I must thank Professor Bibhash Choudhury and the really vibrant audience today for listening to and interrogating certain issues and points that we have made that have really made the discussion all the more vibrant and thought-provoking. Actually, we at the Department of English, University of Gour have a plan to make this online lecture series a really meaningful academic venture. The next open lecture that we are going to host on July 1, 2020 will be delivered by Dr. Mane Leader from the University of Manitoba, Canada, and he will be talking about film studies, its past and futures. So I must call it a day by thanking everyone for bearing with us, because there have been issues with the network connectivity, but your presence has given us a real fillip. Thank you all.